I have something to say about most shonen anime. While I do believe that there are a few good ones out there that exist, like Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood and Death Note, most shonen anime in general are terrible. Shonen anime typically have most of the same problems. Usually, the main characters are typically way overpowered and usually win fights due to plot armor, and most shonen anime do a terrible job justifying how most characters would make it through their entire storyline by just having some convenient way of moving the characters forward, even though most shonen anime have no real progression developing the characters. I mean, they usually just ass pull and win fights, and I think that's really technically the biggest problem, really. Usually, most shonen anime run dry after a few arcs, or sometimes just immediately being bad, because they usually sometimes either condense information about each thing going on into just one episode, sometimes even one, two, maybe three episodes, or extending dragged on things for like 10 episodes before we even see the next conflict or next thing that just happens in general. The romance in most shonen anime is usually cheesy and poorly written, and rarely at any part of the show actually good, and most shonen anime fights usually are lame watching, because the shows don't even have a real strategy where the characters would win by some smart logic, instead of just pulling shit out of their ass to win each fight simply because the story demands it. Jujutsu Kaisen is no exception to this, and usually has many tropes like most typical shonen anime do, and in reality, the show has not much to it overall. One of the biggest problems in Jujutsu Kaisen is that the show is just too tonally inconsistent and becomes way too silly to take the show seriously, and this is what I believe ruins the show from really being worth anyone's time. It's a show with not really much to it, so it just feels like nothing watching it, and just ends up feeling more like a bad, cheesy comedy show than anything really trying to tell an actual story with developed characters. With that in place, let's go farther in depth why I believe Jujutsu Kaisen is actually pretty bad and is really just a forgettable piece of trash with not much to it. Jujutsu Kaisen's plot is about a boy named Yuji who, after his grandfather's death, is just told to be a hero, and afterwards has his body taken over by the Demon King Sukuna, and gains these powers after eating a finger and swallowing the whole thing in one gulp. After, he's also trained by a mentor named Gojo and trains him to become stronger by being punched by a teddy bear and watching movies to defeat evil curses that live inside other people. That is the most coherent description I could actually give of the entire series and what it's about, as I've only seen all of the first season that came out and never watched the movie Jujutsu Kaisen 0 and never read the manga. The first episode is just there showing us Yuji and his grandfather, who's about to pass away, which already gives us a weak start in the show, because not only is it just over the top with how dramatic Yuji's grandfather just passes away when we only knew him for a single episode, but it's also weak because all Yuji's grandfather tells him is generic weak dialogue right before his death, and we're supposed to hold on to his words and expect giving a shit for the rest of the series, when the anime never really shows us anything about his grandfather, and we're just supposed to hold on, look at Yuji as a character, because the anime isn't subtle enough, really getting us invested into Yuji Itadori and his grandfather's relationship. Now, one thing you might be wondering is whether or not they even bother developing Yuji's grandfather as a character throughout the entire show to actually make us see what really matters about him as a character, but unfortunately, the show never actually shows us anything about him, even in any of the later episodes of the first season, and literally just expects us to care about his grandfather passing away in the first episode. The reason why I harp on this moment in particular is because the show really has no strong grip with its main protagonist, as Yuji feels like a bland character with not much to him. And because they don't even develop him and his grandfather that well, it just has nothing really placed strongly in the whole story. The show also ruins him because his development feels a bit wonky as the show's comedy takes over what the story is about and has a really bad tonal shift that ruins the show from being able to be taken seriously. Soon he eventually meets his friends Megami, who just looks like Gray from Fairy Tail, Nobara, and his teacher Gojo, who all go to a school for Jujutsu sorcerers. I also forgot the name of the school they go to because the show is honestly unmemorable with its settings and most of its characters, since most of the art in the show is also so bad and also uninspiring. And because the show has really not much to it overall, I mean, you won't really care or really remember these characters that well anyways, because nothing really that strong happens in the entire show. I really find nothing at all memorable about most of these characters since they're all feel really underdeveloped. And even when they write female characters, they just all feel boring because there's just not much to anyone. Or at the very least, since the show just tries to be silly too much, there's not much focus enough to actually take the characters seriously to find them interesting as people. And going back to the first episode, I just want to mention that the reason why it has no real strong grip is because it's just so, over dramatic. And it just looks more funny than anything else. Like, the show has a problem trying to be serious because it also just goes way off and it just becomes, really just becomes silly nonsense. I hardly know much about Nobara other than the fact around episode 3, she just wants to go to Tokyo, and the show doesn't actually have much grip to her because the show just ruins its tone by shifting being more goofy. Later on in the show, we're also introduced to another party member who's literally a talking panda, and I actually got really annoyed by this because first off, pandas don't talk and speak and definitely don't speak English, and the least they could have had to make the show a bit more entertaining with its humor was have the characters see that it was a talking panda literally acting like it's a human being, and they should really somehow be fazed by what it's doing. Like, the fact that they're not even fazed is kind of jarring to me. Like, it's a talking panda, for God's sakes. That's not normal, dude. It's just really jarring to me to see a talking panda bear in a show, and everyone somehow just thinks it's normal to see a talking panda, and nobody thinks it's ever a bit weird it happens. Speaking of how the show just writes stories about characters and just crams it all into a single episode, Panda is also a victim of this trope, much like how Yuji's grandfather just passes away in the first episode. I think it's around episode 15, I think we're probably showing this, but it's definitely in one of the episodes, I know that for sure. If I actually remember what exact episode it was placed in, but I just remember that Panda was maybe experimented on when he was a panda cub, and that's it. I don't remember exactly for, because the show handles things too shortly to actually care about. You can't just expect your audience to care and actually give a shit when backstories are just shoved in 5 minutes and expect to just hold on to the information for the rest of the show to care about when it's barely focused on. I also want to mention, as addition to the awful character designs in this show, that Panda's special power is that he has the ability to turn into half panda and half gorilla to fight enemies. I mean, just look at how stupid he looks. I mean, really? Just moving on. I kind of want to just go back and talk about the biggest problem with the show as a whole and talk about its serious tonal issue that ruins the show. It's not even just the heroes that act this way, but the villains are also ridiculous also. There's a villain whose design is literally just a fat cyclops that looks like an anime version of Patrick Star, who wears a Hawaiian shirt and has a puny little volcano on top of his head. I mean, just look at this guy. How the hell does this guy seriously look like he'd be a true, cool, badass, evil villain? I won't even mention the other guys who are villains since they're all characters you forget about in 2 seconds after watching this crap, so I won't even bother talking about them. I will, however, mention that how there's moments where they just hang out near a hot tub a lot, or the one cringy moment where Jogo, who's actually the name of the weird Cyclops guy I mentioned about, where the other villains play with his head and use it to play volleyball, and that just literally happens. Like, it's just so weird and silly. A lot of strange moments happen in the show, and a lot of the comedy's issues all head to the biggest problem with the show, which is how poorly they handle Gojo as a character, as he's really just a dumbass who doesn't actually teach his students any real things to become more powerful and better at fighting curses, and instead just typically just always acts goofy and strange interacting with everyone around him. And this also affects Yuji's development negatively as a character, as not only does Yuji just have plot armor just for the sake of the plot, but the way how everything presents his character moving forward is presented terribly and poorly written, because the problem is that the humor in the show takes over the plot and makes the story too hard to actually take anything seriously. Going back to around the beginning of the show, let's actually talk about how Sukuna awakens inside him, and let's talk about the fact that he just swallows a finger whole. Yuji swallows a finger with a literal claw on the end of it whole somehow, and makes me question and think it's weird how when you just gulp a finger, especially with a claw on it, how the claw doesn't just rip open his throat and just kill him right for doing that without even chewing the damn finger. I mean, it's a literal claw. The thing literally looks like it could literally just cut human flesh open in like 2 seconds. And he just swallows the damn thing without chewing it, and he just, like, eats it. Like, dude, like, how strong is your throat that you could just gulp a finger down without even chewing the damn thing? He doesn't choke. He doesn't, like, have a problem even swallowing it. He just eats it. I think it's honestly weird to begin with that eating fingers would be the way that you would even get powers to begin with, since eating a finger doesn't seem like a normal diet for a human to begin with. At least even in a show like One Piece. And I know One Piece isn't a perfect show overall, and it has many of its own flaws as an entire work, but even in One Piece, the things that characters eat to gain powers are at least fruits, which are a fairly normal thing to consume to get powers, because at least a devil fruit is at least a somewhat normal diet for a human being. In Jujutsu Kaisen, however, eating a finger is somehow more normal and fitting in this universe, and somehow there are no reactions to it, even that it would be abnormal to eat such an odd object that typically nobody would ever eat. And nobody even thinks that it's just weird in general that they're even eating fingers. Like, it's just so weird. What's even more strange is that in order to gain powers back for Yuji, he actually needs to consume more fingers just to remain powerful, so he can fight other monsters, and it's not even really explained why, and really this is actually a problem to begin with, that he has these such powers, because that all goes ahead with who actually controls his body when Yuji doesn't have a grip on his body himself. I find it convenient that the first finger Yuji swallowed allowed the Demon King of all characters to reside in his body and take control of it whenever things fall into Sukuna's hands. It makes me also kind of wonder if Yuji will end up eventually having to defeat Sukuna later on in later seasons of the anime once they're released. Once the later seasons are released. And I kind of question how it really works that Yuji loses control of his body sometimes, and then Sukuna doesn't even want to relinquish control of it after, and doesn't even care if Yuji dies, really. I mean, not only do I think it's really just a ripoff version of Ling Yao and Greed from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which where I definitely see parallels since both relationships are written exactly similar to each other, since both characters end up having evil characters taking over each other's body. But beyond that, I would honestly have to question Sukuna's motives himself as a character, since he's really using Ryuji as a vessel, and I wonder why he wouldn't just use him as a pod for resurrection, instead of just, not caring if he dies, really. All this is nonsense because at the end of the day, the only reason why Yuji gained these powers to begin with and had the Demon King inside him is because it's only convenient that the main character has all these powers to win fights. That's not even to mention the fact that Yuji literally survives ripping his own heart out. That literally happens and gets revived later on because he's literally just that strong, and the only character they give him moving forward progressing the story is just his grandfather's dying words that you're just supposed to give a shit about. I don't really hold much weight on the whole story, where the story is heading with its direction, and that's because Yuji is a poorly written protagonist. Moving past that, let's actually talk about Gojo as a character and why I have a serious issue with him. It's mainly because the show tries to write him as being a mentor to these kids. He trains, but he never actually feels like a real teacher, and more like a kid himself based on the way he always acts throughout the show. I've been waiting to talk about this moment for a while, but I think the worst scene in the entire show is in episode 8, where Gojo actually teaches Yuji a way that he's going to fight curses, and it makes no sense in context with the rest of the show. Now, I will be fair and say this. I will say that this scene would have worked better in something if it was just written as a joke and not taken seriously. However, that's actually where we deconstruct and break down why exactly the scene is so bad. It's mainly because of the fact the scene is so goofy and outrageous that it's literally impossible to actually take seriously on any level. And by this point, the show was completely dead for me, and Jujutsu Kaisen had no recovery after. Here's what happens. Gojo literally trains Yuji fighting curses, which are what the monsters are called in this universe, by literally just laying on the couch and watching movies all day, while also having a teddy bear punching him in the face. This scene is garbage for many reasons. It not only permanently shows that Yuji is a bland character with ruined development, because the show's humor is trash taking over the story, ruining it, taking it seriously, but it also shows a literal moment that proves Gojo is really a dumbass when we're supposed to believe that he's supposed to be this bright mentor for training students. Yes, I also find his character design unappealing, as he also just literally looks like Kakashi from Naruto. In fact, all these characters in the show really just look like generic character models that could literally be from any other anime, really, if you really want me to be honest with you. When you discover they both literally have spiky gray hair, both characters have cloth covering their faces, and they just look similar in general with only minor differences. But my problems go a little beyond just that. Although I do want to mention that since he's a mentor like Kakashi, it is actually blatantly similar how much these two characters act and look like each other, since they're also both silly also. To be honest with you, I would even argue that Gojo even looks a little bit really kind of too similar to 9S, actually, from Nier Automata. I don't even know if anyone's even mentioned that yet. But moving on, if you think about it, Gojo in many ways is actually no different than Kamina from Gurren Lagann, who believes that being a man is just being a dumb pervert and being a hot-headed dumbass. It's mainly because, like Kamina, only unlike the fact that Kamina dies in 8 episodes and was disappointing, Gojo is just a silly dumbass with has no traits about him that proves that he's actually intelligent. Well, unlike Kamina, though, Gojo doesn't die, and he's there throughout the whole entire rest of the show. Although, like Kamina, Gojo is just a silly dumbass. Has no traits about him that proves that he's actually intelligent. We're never given one single memorable moment in the span of all 24 episodes that Gojo teaches students an important lesson that actually helps them grow and become stronger as people and at all. And all we're ever shown in each episode is just him being a goofy, silly dumbass. It just ruins any believable measure that he's actually a smart teacher and actually has any depth to his character. He's just another character that continues the bad trope of not knowing how to write a real teacher in a storyline. The fact that he believes that watching movies is just enough to defeat your enemies is complete nonsense. Unfortunately, I have news. Sitting around being a lazy fat ass isn't how you become more muscular and strong how to fight anything. This show is ridiculous. Gojo doesn't feel like he ever has any intelligent wisdom as a leader, just having Yuji laid down, getting punched by a teddy bear, and it's just all off-putting and uncanny. Hell, even at least in Naruto itself, despite also its own problems as a show as a whole, Kakashi at least has a few times where he actually teaches a few real lessons Naruto must learn if his dream really was being Hokage. And it was at least memorable when Kakashi taught everyone the moment to work where they had to work together more, where they weren't even allowed to share food with Naruto, and had to create a plan of risk, which right there in itself compares to a show what a dog shit mentor Gojo is, because he literally teaches nothing to Yuji or literally any other character in this terrible show. That's why I believe this scene literally destroys the entire show, even just by itself, because it's a perfect example of how the comedic tone in this show just takes over the whole storyline, making it impossible to take the show seriously, and the show now becomes completely over-bloated dog shit. It shows that the show has no idea what it's doing, developing any of its characters, because the show has no focus and direction presenting its story together well, and feels unbalanced, being either over dramatic or just crossing the bar too much, just looking terrible and goofy. The show doesn't even bother giving itself any time fixing what a strange scene that was by having Gojo at least saying that it was just meant as a joke, and actually shows Yuji a real way to train afterwards, which in itself would have actually fixed this terrible moment itself, to actually grip its viewers more and make the show more believable how the characters would actually train just by that, in itself. Another show that has this problem was Hellsing Ultimate, which I also didn't like, mainly because the show is poorly managed with how it managed its tone at some parts felt like it was trying to be dark, and other times it just looked awful because the show was just silly right after, sometimes being really edgy and dark, and completely ruins any serious tone the show was trying to present. And that's all by comparison to just show another show that also had many of the same problems that Jujutsu Kaisen has, because I believe the problems with Jujutsu Kaisen also just really stem from the fact that this show's comedic tone just is like way too extreme and just takes over the story entirely, making it impossible to take seriously. It's not comedy itself that ruins a show. Comedy could actually be used for many good things in a show, to actually even give the characters more personality and make them more likable. It could actually add to the tone of a series, whether if it's dark or light. And I think that, comedy, if it's just written well, could actually be utilized good in the entire story. But it's the way that it's utilized, and also really just how good the humor is in the show to begin with, how exactly funny it is, and what's even, like, what's really the logic behind the comedy and what's actually, funny. Moving on from all that, let's just talk about the final episode, or at the very least near the end of the show, and then we'll be done. The show just kind of ends after fighting two more random villains they fight, and the only notable thing that really happens is that Nobara just has a slight crush on Yuji, and the show ends. The show has other issues with its stories, for example, a ton of other characters that have zero development, but they aren't really worth mentioning, much as they do nothing memorable or interesting in the entire show, and you'll likely forget about their existence after you're done with the show, such as Kasumi, for example, whose only trait is that she has this weird infatuation with Gojo for some reason, and there's really nothing to that at all. Other than the show's story, I found most of the soundtrack unmemorable except the first ending song, which I'll admit is actually pretty good, despite not being one of my personal favorite songs ever. It's just, not really one of my favorites. The first ending song, that's what I'm talking about. The show's art and visuals looks downright terrible, often having visuals that feel like they could exist easily in a million different anime that are exactly similar, and the character designs look like people just puked all over a piece of paper and animated it, calling it art. This show has honestly some of the worst looking art I've ever seen in my life, and that's actually quite saying something, as the show's art looks like it's been plunged out of a toilet with poop stains all over it. It's not Higurashi's levels of bad art design, but that's not saying much. I think the worst looking characters in the entire show are Yuji, Gojo, and that villain Jogo. Gojo, who's obviously a Kakashi ripoff, and Yuji, who literally looks like a street degenerate punk with his odd spiky hair, and the way that his face looks like he's shaped like a crackhead. And, Jogo I've already talked about. I don't like his design because he looks like a silly goofball as a villain. The show looks very weak, uninspired. It has very low effort put into its aesthetic quality to make the show look like it's not just your typical anime, just worked on, thrown out of a sweatshop. Wow, dude. I gotta say, so, for the whole, conclusion, I honestly wasn't a big fan of this series. I think Jujutsu Kaisen has serious tonal defecation, doesn't really have much being creative for a shonen anime to be a true classic, and feels unmemorable with its cast of characters because the show is so boring and has focus only being weird, not being able to take it seriously. And it just, it just ruins, the story. It has, all these problems where it just gets way too silly and bloated with how it's just trying to be funny when it's really not, and it's just stupid. I don't think it's as bad as an anime as Tokyo Ghoul or Evangelion 3.33 You Cannot Redo, but that doesn't say much. I think Jujutsu Kaisen feels too bloated with how strange and silly it becomes, and just has no focus telling a story and becomes tonally out of whack with what it's doing and trying to make. That's why my final rating for Jujutsu Kaisen is, I'll be generous and honestly probably give it a 2 out of 10. That's probably a little bit generous. I might really honestly give it a 1, to be honest with you, but I'll just say it depends on my mood. I wasn't a big fan of the show. I thought there was really nothing to it, and it was only trying to be extremely funny, when in reality, the show really wasn't, and it was pretty dumb overall. It felt bloated, while gaps felt missing from the show to actually tell a good story. Thank you for watching and understanding my point of view on the show. Just remember, I love all my subscribers. I respect everyone's, taste. I mean, if you like this show, that's totally okay. And I have no problem with that at all. I love all my subscribers, and I consider all my viewers and subscribers my friends. I love everyone, and thank you for watching. Let me know if you agree with my review or not down below, and I'm grateful for all your support on my channel. Thank you very much, and thank you for watching this video. Thanks, guys.